David Carter strode confidently through the bustling terminal of JFK Airport, his sleek designer sneakers tapping against the polished floor. His phone was practically glued to his hand as he live-streamed his every move to his thousands of followers. "All right, guys, you're not going to believe this," he said, flashing a self-satisfied grin at the camera. "First-class upgrade, baby. You know your boy always flies in style." His audience responded with a flood of comments, a mix of admiration, envy, and the occasional critique. David reveled in the attention. Fame was his currency, and he had plenty of it. His channel, infamous for its edgy takes and biting humor, had catapulted him into the spotlight. Every post, every comment, every viral video added to his growing empire. As he navigated the crowd, David caught glimpses of people glancing his way, some whispering and pointing. He puffed out his chest, knowing he was recognized. He paused by a large window overlooking the tarmac and panned his phone to capture the view of planes preparing for departure. "Look at this," he narrated dramatically. "New York behind me, LA ahead of me. This is what success looks like, people." What his followers didn't see, however, was the nagging feeling that had been creeping up on David lately. Beneath the surface of his confidence lay a growing pressure to keep up the act. He brushed it aside, convincing himself that as long as the likes and comments poured in, he was winning. Reaching the first-class check-in counter, David greeted the staff with a smirk. The agent confirmed his upgrade, and he waved his phone at the camera. "Let's go. First class is where I belong." He exaggerated the moment, knowing it would add to the allure of his online persona. But as he walked toward the gate, he couldn't shake a sense of unease. Something about this trip felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. David's excitement reached its peak as he stepped onto the plane, his phone recording every moment. The pristine white seats of the first-class cabin gleamed under the soft lighting. He took his time capturing every luxurious detail: the spacious legroom, the oversized screens, and the attendants in crisp uniforms. "All right, everyone, this is how you travel," David said, angling his phone to show the glass of champagne being handed to him. "Cheers to leveling up in life." His followers flooded the chat with comments, ranging from admiration to playful jealousy. Settling into his seat, David couldn't resist narrating his surroundings. "These seats are practically thrones. I mean, who needs to fight battles when you've already won the war of success? Am I right?" His laughter echoed through the cabin, drawing glances from nearby passengers. As the plane taxied down the runway, David leaned back, raising his glass to the camera. "To all the haters out there, this one's for you," he quipped, smirking. He scrolled through his comments, noticing a few that didn't align with his usual fanfare. "Be careful, man. Not everyone's living your life. Flexing is fun until it backfires. Show some humility, dude," David scoffed, brushing off the criticism. "People love to act all righteous when they're not in my shoes," he muttered. As the plane ascended, David's attention wandered to the passengers around him. Most were engrossed in their own worlds, reading, sleeping, or quietly sipping drinks. But one man stood out. Seated next to David was an elderly gentleman with silver hair and a weathered face. He wore a plain button-up shirt, and his hands rested on a small leather case that seemed to hold deep significance. David glanced at the man and rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, "Looks like someone wandered into the wrong cabin." Turning back to his phone, he made a sarcastic comment to his audience. "Guess even first class has its surprises. Hope I don't get stuck hearing a life story." His audience laughed along, but a few comments reminded him to be respectful. David ignored them, focusing instead on curating the perfect image of his luxurious experience. As the flight attendants began service, David turned back to his neighbor. The man hadn't spoken a word, his gaze fixed on the leather case in his lap. David found himself inexplicably curious, but quickly dismissed the feeling. He was here to enjoy himself, not to make small talk. What David didn't realize was that this quiet passenger carried a story that would soon collide with his, altering the course of his journey in ways he never imagined. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, David's curiosity about the elderly man sitting next to him grew. Despite his dismissive exterior, he couldn't help but glance at the small leather case the man held so carefully. The case was scuffed but sturdy, the kind of object that had clearly seen decades of life. It intrigued David, though he quickly masked his interest with sarcasm. Turning his phone's camera discreetly toward the man, David whispered to his followers, "Check out this guy. I bet there's a pair of ancient glasses or maybe some collector's stamps in that thing." His followers responded with mixed reactions. Some laughed along, while others reminded him to respect his neighbor's privacy. David, emboldened by the supportive comments, decided to push further. He leaned slightly toward the man, feigning casual interest. "So, what's in the case?" he asked, his tone more mocking than genuine. The elderly man looked up, his eyes kind yet sharp. "Something important," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. He offered no further explanation and returned his focus to the case, as if the conversation had ended. David rolled his eyes and turned back to his phone. "Well, that was mysterious," he muttered to his audience. "Probably just some old coins or family heirlooms. Nothing exciting." The man remained silent, his demeanor unshaken. This only added to David's frustration. He thrived on reactions, and this man wasn't giving him anything to work with. As the attendants served dinner, David continued his live stream, narrating every detail of the meal with exaggerated enthusiasm. Occasionally, his camera would catch the man beside him, sitting quietly with his untouched tray. David couldn't resist throwing in a few more comments. "Guess he's not a fan of first-class dining either," he quipped, drawing laughter from some followers but disapproval from others. One comment stood out. "Dude, he's a war veteran. Show some respect." David paused, reading the comment aloud. "A war veteran?" He turned to the man, now eyeing him with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Hey, are you a veteran or something?" he asked, his voice louder than it needed to be. The man glanced at him briefly but didn't answer. Instead, he placed the leather case carefully on his lap, his fingers brushing over it with a reverence that caught David off guard. David shrugged, turning back to his phone. "No confirmation, folks. Maybe, maybe not. But if he is, you'd think he'd have something more interesting to say, right?" The comments section began to fill with admonishments, but David ignored them. He was too focused on maintaining his persona to realize that his words were setting him on a dangerous path. The hours dragged on, and David found his attention drifting back to the elderly man. Something about the way the man handled the leather case gnawed at him. When the man finally opened it, David couldn't resist leaning over to get a closer look. Inside the case lay a gleaming medal of honor, its intricate design unmistakable. Even David, whose historical knowledge was limited to what he had seen in movies and documentaries, recognized the prestigious medal. "Whoa," he muttered, his voice betraying a hint of awe before he caught himself. Pulling out his phone, he quickly began filming. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a medal of honor in the house. Talk about carrying history on your lap." The elderly man didn't react, but David wasn't done. "You don't see this every day," he said, angling his phone to capture the medal. "But honestly, what's the point of lugging this thing around? It's not like anyone cares anymore." He laughed lightly, but this time the comments flooding his screen were overwhelmingly negative. "Stop being a jerk. Delete this, David. Seriously, do you even know what that medal means?" David frowned, his usual confidence faltering for a moment. "Relax, guys," he said, attempting to brush off the backlash. "It's just a medal." The man finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with a quiet strength. "It's not just a medal." He closed the case with deliberate care, turning to face David for the first time. "This represents lives, some saved, some lost. It's a reminder of the sacrifices people make so others can live freely." David froze, his bravado momentarily shattered. He glanced at the comments on his screen, many of which echoed the man's words. For the first time, he felt a pang of discomfort, but he quickly buried it under a layer of indifference. "Well, that's deep," David said awkwardly, turning back to his phone. But as he scrolled through the stream of comments, the weight of what he had just witnessed began to sink in. He didn't know it yet, but this moment was the beginning of a shift, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his influence. By the time the flight landed in Los Angeles, David's phone was buzzing relentlessly. As he gathered his belongings, he noticed an unsettling change in his notifications. Likes and supportive comments had been replaced by angry messages and critical posts. Disrespectful. Do better, David. This guy doesn't deserve a platform. Confused and defensive, David skimmed through the flood of reactions. A few influential accounts had picked up clips from his live stream, resharing his mockery of the elderly man and the Medal of Honor. The outrage spread quickly, with people calling him out for his ignorance and lack of respect. Can you believe this? David muttered to himself, trying to rationalize the backlash. People are so sensitive these days. As he stepped off the plane, the elderly man, who had remained composed throughout the flight, gave David a small nod before disappearing into the crowd. David stared after him, momentarily unsure of what to feel. By the time he reached the terminal, the reality of the situation hit him. News outlets and social media platforms were ablaze with discussions about his behavior. The words Medal of Honor and disrespect trended alongside his name. Veterans groups, families, and even some of his own fans were publicly condemning him. David tried to ignore it at first, but the notifications kept piling up. His followers, once fiercely loyal, were turning against him. He scrolled through post after post, each one more scathing than the last. You don't deserve your platform. This isn't just about the medal, it's about basic human decency. Imagine mocking someone who risked their life for others. David's stomach churned. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had built his career on sharp commentary and controversial opinions, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. He tried to shake off the guilt, telling himself it would all blow over. But deep down, he knew this wasn't something he could easily escape. Later that evening, David found himself pacing in his hotel room, unable to focus on anything but the growing backlash. His attempts to distract himself, playing video games, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, only made things worse. The clips of him mocking the Medal of Honor were everywhere, and each new comment felt like a blow to his carefully constructed image. Against his better judgment, he decided to reach out to the one person who might understand, the elderly man from the flight. Through the airline's assistance, he managed to contact the man, who agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe in downtown Los Angeles. When David arrived, the man was already seated, sipping a cup of tea. He greeted David with the same calm demeanor he had shown on the plane. I wasn't sure you'd come, David admitted awkwardly, sitting down across from him. The man gave a faint smile. Curiosity has a way of leading people to unexpected places. David hesitated, unsure how to begin. Look, I messed up, he said finally, his voice unsteady. I didn't mean to disrespect you, or the medal. I didn't think it through. The man studied him for a moment before nodding. Acknowledging a mistake is a good start, he said. David felt a flicker of hope. Can I ask, why do you carry it with you? The medal, what does it mean to you? The man, whose name David learned was George Henry Adams, set down his cup of tea and began to speak. The Medal of Honor isn't just a symbol of personal achievement, he explained. It represents the sacrifices of many, the friends I lost, the battles we fought, and the lives we tried to save. I carry it with me not to boast, but to remind myself and others of what was given so that we could have the freedoms we often take for granted. David listened intently, his earlier flippancy replaced by genuine curiosity. George went on to share his story. His service during World War II, the mission that earned him the medal, and the friends who didn't make it home. People see the medal and think of glory, George said quietly. But for me, it's a reminder of loss. It's a responsibility to honor those who can no longer tell their stories. David felt a lump in his throat as George spoke. For the first time, he understood the weight of what he had mocked so carelessly. I'm sorry, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize. I didn't think about what it meant. George nodded, his expression softening. You're young. You're still learning. But now that you know better, what will you do about it? David didn't have an answer yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't continue as if nothing had happened. George's words stayed with him, sparking a sense of responsibility he had never felt before. After meeting George, David returned to his hotel room, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite sort through. He replayed the conversation in his head, hearing George's calm yet profound words, "Now that you know better, what will you do about it?" David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. His social media accounts were still buzzing with criticism. Normally, he would have fought back, defending his actions or turning the backlash into another publicity stunt. But this time was different. He felt the weight of the public's outrage, and for once, he agreed with them. He scrolled through the comments, letting the words sink in. "Grow up, David. The world doesn't revolve around you." Imagine mocking someone who sacrificed so much. You have a platform. Use it for good instead of tearing people down. For the first time in his career, David didn't see the comments as attacks. They were truths he had been avoiding for far too long. His obsession with fame and validation had blinded him to the harm he caused. David pulled out a notebook from his bag, something he rarely used. He began jotting down his thoughts. Why do I do what I do? What do I stand for? How can I fix this? Hours passed as he reflected on his actions and the power of his influence. George's story had shaken him, not just because of its gravity, but because it exposed the emptiness of David's own pursuits. He realized that his platform had the potential to be more than just a tool for self-promotion. Staring at the blank page before him, David made a decision. He couldn't erase what he had done, but he could take responsibility for it. He could learn, grow, and use his voice to amplify stories that deserve to be heard. The next morning, David set up his phone for a live stream, his heart pounding with nerves. This wasn't going to be one of his usual broadcasts. He wasn't looking for laughs or likes. He was about to own up to his mistakes in a way he had never done before. As the stream went live, thousands of viewers tuned in, many of them waiting to see what he would say. David took a deep breath and began. "Hey everyone. I want to start by saying I've made a lot of mistakes, but the one I made on that flight is something I deeply regret. I disrespected a man who has given more to this world than I could ever imagine, and I mocked something that represents the highest level of sacrifice." The comments started pouring in. "About time you admitted it. Let's see if this apology is real. Respect to George." David continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I met George Henry Adams, a Medal of Honor recipient, and I acted like a complete fool. I didn't take the time to understand what that medal means, not just to him, but to all the people it honors. George didn't have to forgive me, but he chose to share his story with me, and it changed the way I see everything." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I know an apology isn't enough, but I want to do more. I want to use my platform to honor stories like George's. From now on, I'm committing to sharing content that uplifts and educates, instead of tearing people down." The stream ended with David thanking his audience for holding him accountable. The response was mixed at first. Some viewers were skeptical, while others appreciated his honesty. But David wasn't doing this for immediate approval. He was doing it because it felt right. Later that day, David reached out to George again, asking for his blessing to share his story. George agreed, on the condition that the focus remained on the sacrifices of others, not just his own. Inspired by their conversation, David began planning a documentary-style video that would spotlight George and other veterans. As David worked on the project, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced before. This wasn't about views or followers. It was about giving back. And for the first time, David realized that using his platform for good felt far more fulfilling than any viral stunt ever had. David poured his heart and soul into the documentary project, determined to do justice to George's story and the sacrifices of countless other veterans. He spent weeks meeting with George, recording interviews, and researching the history behind the Medal of Honor. With George's help, he also connected with other veterans who shared their own powerful, heart-wrenching stories of bravery, loss, and resilience. The project became more than just a video. It was a journey of transformation for David. As he edited the footage late into the night, he often found himself moved to tears by the courage and selflessness of the men and women he interviewed. Their stories weren't just tales of heroism. They were reminders of the humanity and sacrifice behind every medal, every flag, and every salute. When the documentary, titled "The Cost of Freedom," was finally released, it was nothing like the flashy, fast-paced content David's audience was used to. It was raw, emotional, and deeply respectful. The video began with David addressing his own mistakes and explaining why he felt compelled to share these stories. From there, the narrative shifted to George and the other veterans, letting their words and experiences take center stage. The public response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in from viewers who were deeply moved by the documentary. "This is the best thing you've ever done. Thank you for honoring our heroes. My grandfather was a Medal of Honor recipient, and this brought tears to my eyes." Veterans organizations reached out to thank David for his efforts, and the documentary even caught the attention of major news outlets. David's name, once associated with controversy and arrogance, now appeared alongside words like respect, redemption, and growth. George, ever humble, downplayed his own role in the project. "The real heroes," he told David during one of their final interviews, "are the ones who didn't make it home. We're just the ones lucky enough to tell their stories." For David, those words became a guiding principle. He realized that his newfound mission wasn't just about repairing his image. It was about using his platform to amplify voices that truly mattered. In the months that followed the release of The Cost of Freedom, David fully embraced his new direction. He continued to connect with veterans and their families, sharing their stories through a dedicated series on his channel. Each episode focused on a different individual or group, highlighting their sacrifices, challenges, and triumphs. The series didn't just resonate with his audience, it changed lives. Viewers were inspired to volunteer at veterans organizations, donate to causes supporting military families, and even reach out to their own loved ones who had served. David's platform grew in ways he hadn't anticipated. Schools and community groups invited him to speak about the importance of respect, empathy, and learning from past mistakes. He approached these opportunities with humility, always emphasizing that his journey was far from perfect. During one such event at a high school, David stood beside George as they addressed a room full of students. George shared his story, as he had so many times before, but this time, David added his own perspective. "I used to think that being an influencer meant having a big audience," David told the students. "But George taught me that real influence comes from using your voice to lift others up. And I'll never forget that." As the applause filled the room, David glanced at George, who gave him a small, approving nod. It was a moment of quiet affirmation, a reminder of how far David had come and how much further he could go. Over time, David's content evolved into a blend of storytelling, advocacy, and education. He launched initiatives to support veterans, including fundraisers and partnerships with organizations providing housing, healthcare, and mental health services for those who had served. David's journey from arrogance to redemption became a story in itself, a testament to the power of accountability, growth, and the courage to change. And though he never forgot the backlash that had brought him to this point, he came to see it as a necessary step in his transformation. As for George, he remained a steady presence in David's life, offering wisdom and guidance whenever it was needed. Their unlikely friendship became a symbol of respect and understanding across generations, a reminder that it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to make things right. David's new mission, inspired by George's quiet heroism, wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about building a future where stories like George's would never be forgotten. And for the first time in his career, David felt truly fulfilled, not by fame, but by purpose. In the end, David's journey was a testament to the power of humility, accountability, and the courage to embrace change. What began as a selfish pursuit of fame transformed into a meaningful mission to honor the sacrifices of those who had given everything for others. Through George's wisdom and the stories of countless veterans, David found a new sense of purpose, one that was rooted not in seeking attention but in inspiring respect and understanding. His platform became a tool for good, and his story became a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever stumbled and sought a way to rise again. David's redemption wasn't just about correcting his mistakes. It was about becoming the person he had always aspired to be, a person who truly made a difference. And as he continued to share stories of courage, sacrifice, and resilience, he realized that his greatest achievement wasn't the size of his audience, but the depth of the impact he left behind. Somewhere, George's words echoed in his mind. "Now that you know better, What will you do about it? David answered that question, not just with words, but with actions that would resonate for generations to come. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story and for being part of this journey. It means the world to me that you stuck around until the end. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently, I'd really appreciate it if you could give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and of course, subscribe to the channel for more meaningful content. Your support helps me continue to share stories like this, honoring incredible individuals and shining a light on important issues. Let's keep this conversation going. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.